Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the great perfection, and that is characterized by the quality of not having any aversion or external desire to the current experience that you are having. You could also perhaps call this the great peace or the great bliss, the great calmness of consciousness. Now, usually human beings are not connected to this state, and you can definitely enter this state just through sober meditation, just through silence, and that is sort of the goal that we're working towards. But if you've never tasted before this great perfection, then music can be a great way to access it. So I think it's interesting that in the Hindu tradition, they have a goddess called Saraswati. She is the white goddess, the pure goddess, and she is very closely associated with musical instruments. In particular, she's usually holding a stringed instrument called a sitar, and you can think of her as being this ocean of milk, this calm ocean of milk. And this symbolism ties back very directly to the state of consciousness that we might have had when drinking milk from our mother while being held in her safe bosom, which would be a place of perfect calm, a place of perfect sustenance, and that is very much what the great perfection is like when you experience it, even as an adult. And music can be a fantastic way to experience this today if you are interested in this topic. Entheogens, psychedelic drugs, they can be a good way to open one's mind to the beauty and grandeur and abstraction of music in general. But in this particular exercise, I'm intending for you to do this through a sober state of mind, because psychedelics, they tend to be very stimulating, whereas today we want a great calmness to come into our consciousness. So when listening to music, the mind tends to delight in it quite a lot because there are predictable rhythms, and the harmony, however, tends to have a bit of novelty to it. So there is a curious aspect to the music and a predictable aspect to the music, which the human mind just tends to like. The human mind likes novelty, but it likes to understand as well the overall picture of what is going on. So I recommend listening to instrumental music and something without lyrics, because lyrics tend to build stories and create a very structured meaning to the song. We are going to be attempting to enter a space of pure intellectual abstraction. If you have experienced music on psychedelics, you've maybe come into contact with this, where there is a definite meaning to a song, but it goes so far beyond the English language that the only word I can use for that is pure intellectual abstraction. And that pure intellectual abstraction to me feels very, very, very much, almost on a literal level, like an ocean of milk. And the song that comes to mind for me, my favorite one to get me into this headspace, is, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, but it's called Arabesque by Debussy, which is in particular, there's a particular rendition on YouTube, very famous, on the harp. And when I listen to that with my eyes closed in a meditative state while sober, it is so calm, so relaxing. It has such a deep, abstract meaning to it, but I can't put even one sentence to that meaning except the word perhaps grace, elegance. So we are entering, through listening to that song in particular, a space of pure intellectual abstraction of the topic, the theme of grace, this dove-like characteristic of consciousness. So there are many classical songs that have that same vibe, but it doesn't need to be the theme of grace per se. It can be any sort of theme you like. We want the mind to be totally accepting to it, totally drop into that peaceful state, the great perfection state. And that is why the grace aspect can be so good to work with, because that's like being back in your mother's arms, in her bosom as a baby, the ocean of milk. And that is perhaps the greatest equanimity, the greatest perfection that the human consciousness has ever known. Just our consciousness as a baby. Okay, so that's a very foundational introduction now to what we're trying to do. And my suggestion here for you to access this great perfection, once you've got it through listening to a wonderful piece of music, is to let the music end and then just keep sitting in meditation, keep sitting in posture, and see how long the great perfection lasts while there's no music playing, while there's just silence. It's very interesting. I believe it's a Sanskrit word for the heart chakra. It's called the anahata, which means the unstruck sound, the unstruck chord, silence. Okay? So usually when I'm listening to a great song and it finishes, I am still in the great perfection, but not for very long at all. Within 20 seconds, usually the mind comes up with some thought, some excuse, some desire, some aversion, some saying. Perhaps the mind might be like, play another song or replay the song. And it really struggles to sit in silence while having that great perfection state of consciousness. So the trick here is to notice the transition from the great perfection as you were listening to the music to the mind coming back up. Because it can be counterintuitive, but noticing the transition is the successful thing. If you're sitting in the great perfection and then the music stops and you start having thoughts again, that wasn't a failure. Don't think of it as a failure. The success, the double thumbs up, is if you can notice the transition from the great perfection back to monkey mind. Because by noticing the transition, by having consciousness of the transition, your consciousness, your subconscious mind notices where the monkey mind came from. And if you can have perfect awareness, moment by moment in daily life, of thoughts coming out of the great perfection and taking you to monkey mind, if you can notice that, then it's going to keep you connected to the great perfection more, to such an extent that we'll get to the third part now, which is maintaining connection to the great perfection during a cacophonous life. Okay? Because if you live particularly in a city, let's imagine you're on public transport, there are people talking all over the place, train sounds going everywhere, the intercom blaring, it's just a noise. In general, the human mind doesn't like that sort of noise. It likes predictable rhythms with novel harmonies. But if we've been doing this practice of noticing, just as we've talked about earlier, of going from the great perfection to having a thought, we can even have that connection to the great perfection during a cacophonous, noisy situation. And sometimes it's interesting. If there's a bit of cacophony in our life, the mind really finds that agitating and annoying. But if the situation devolves into complete chaos, like for instance a roller coaster ride, just absolute wildness, then once again we find it quite easy to drop back into this great perfection because all the content has no meaning. If we can notice that all thoughts come from the great perfection and then vanish again, we can notice that the great perfection is always there. It is like a substrate of reality. So coming back now, if we are in a silent state of meditation with no music, and we are in the great perfection, we can maintain that connection to perfect bliss, perfect calmness. Then you might notice a thought come up, something silly like, what time is it? You might notice that thought come up, and as it comes up, you notice the transition from perfect calmness to a thought. And because you notice it so clearly, the thought dissolves. It dissolves back away. And what you'll notice is, when the thought dissolves, you go back to the great perfection. So it is quite literally, you can see it almost, you can feel it, you can hear it. There's this perfect quietness, and out of the quietness comes like a flower of thought, and then it dissolves. It's like a wormhole coming out of the ocean and going back to the ocean. And it's just, the thought in itself has no meaning, no substance. It's just a flow. It's anicca, it's impermanence. It's like a stringed instrument there's absolute silence, you hit the string, it resonates, and it dissolves back into nothing. If you are ever in a meditation retreat perhaps, or a Buddhist type of meditation setting, you can very often notice they hit a bell to start off the meditation. That is actually very similar to the whole concept that I'm explaining here. The idea is, when you hear this bell, is to totally focus the mind on that sound, that resonance, that vibration, and to listen to it all the way to silence. It'll start off really loud, get lower and lower and lower until you're in the great perfection. That is sort of the idea behind that gong, or if you like, a stringed instrument as well. So the same thing, however, can be done with thoughts. You can have no thoughts at all, see the thought coming, ringing like a string, and going back to the great perfection. If you can notice that, again, that is the great double thumbs up. We want to notice the transition from the great perfection to a thought back to the great perfection, to see the impermanence of the thought. That is when you're really, really, really getting somewhere. And still, this is the easy part, because right now I'm giving you a nice introductory technique to taste the great perfection, which is to listen to music, then tries to stay connected to the perfection in silence, and then stay connected to the perfection even through having a single thought. Because as the thought comes and the thought goes, you never lose connection to the great perfection. It is always there. But then once you get off your meditation cushion and start interacting with daily life, then it becomes very challenging, because now there is no longer one string, one thought per minute. Now we are talking about 50 inputs a minute. Sounds of trains, intercoms, strangers speaking. So that's a very chaotic, cacophonous situation. But it is still quite possible to notice that all of these seemingly choppy sounds, like a choppy ocean, like a ravenous river, all those seemingly cacophonous sounds, even though they don't have a meaning that the mind can enjoy because it's just confusing to the mind, on an awareness level, we can still notice that this confusion, this cacophony, is coming from the great perfection and returning to the great perfection. And that is when you are, as you could say, in perhaps the Zen tradition, when you are riding the ox, maybe even riding the ox backwards. Even though there are confusing situations out there, it is very apparent that all vibrations, all perceptions are coming out of this great silence, coming out of it and going back to it. All perceptions are just impermanent blips that come and go from this great perfection. So that's really the goal. I wish you best of luck. And as I mentioned earlier, just very recently in a video about non-duality, the theme of identity comes up here. Because normally we have this feeling, this very, very strong feeling that I am over here. But as you notice that even thoughts of me and myself and I are also, those thoughts are also coming from the great perfection and dissolving back into the great perfection. Actually becomes abundant, very perceptually abundant, that all perceptions, absolutely all perceptions and all identities come and go from this ocean, this great ocean of milk. Once you start to dissociate, you're no longer associating with any particular arisal and passing, your identity naturally drops into the great perfection. You quite literally become the great perfection. And the great perfection is ultimately an ocean of goodness. It is the ultimate sustenance. It is the ultimate fountain of youth. Just like an ocean of milk, just like actual milk, it has a very sweet, fragrant aspect to it, but has a very strong sustenance to it. It is not sugar, it is really rich fuel. And if you can access this great perfection, this great ocean of milk, even during a cacophonous life, then you can always have access to this great fountain of youth, and you can be an eternal fountain of goodness and eternal blessing to everyone in every situation.